To date, agriculture, smallholder farmers are not on the radar screen of climate change mitigation funding. For me, it's criminal, and they need to be. So 550 million farmers, we manage over 3 billion hectares. You don't have to pay us, right? I have a vested interest in doing this to improve my productivity. We need investment from my perspective of putting to work these 550 million farmers across the planet to actually start to shift our farms from sources to sinks of carbon.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmons. I'm the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future. And this week we have an extra special program as we have with us a guest, Stephen Sherwood, from all the way from Ecuador. And we're so happy to have you here, Stephen. I understand you're a longtime friend and colleague of the Climate Emergency Forum and the people that are involved with it, and that makes you an extra special guest today. We'll be focusing on a question that many of us think about, which is how do we eat? How do we farm? How do we grow our food in ways that can enhance our climate activism and also provide health, nourishment, equity, and all the other benefits that come out of growing food in appropriate ways. And we're calling our program today Farming Food for Life. So, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Stephen, to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are, why the folks out there should listen to what you have to say. I think the answer, from what I know, is that you've had an enormous amount of important, literally ground level experience, unlike some of us who are theoreticians and academics and read papers and so forth. You're on the ground every day in your fields looking for ways to regenerate the land and the soil as you grow food for the folks in your community. So, with that, welcome, Stephen, and the floor is yours.
Great, great. No, thank you. And nice to meet you, Herb, and to see Paul and Charles and Heidi. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to share the exciting work that's going on here in the Andes. And yeah, I'll present a bit. We're working farmers, kind of for farmers. I grew up on a farm in the United States, and I've been working in Latin America and living and working in Latin America since 1986. So quite a while now. I don't want to do the math, but it's been back, but it's been a while. And I've been living in Ecuador since 98. So got started in Central America. And to be honest with you, growing up on a farm in Pennsylvania, my goal was to get the heck out of the community, right? It was sort of a all white, kind of a racist redneck area. For whatever reason, I became interested in international things. And through, working with, well, a bit with the church, with the Mennonite Central Committee, which is big in Pennsylvania, with the Quakers, who kind of inspired me to think beyond my little community, but also through Peace Corps, a government program, became active in Central America, Nicaragua, and Honduras, working with smallholder farmers. And I plan to go just for a couple of years. And boy, I mean, over 35 years have passed, right? So it's been a while, and nearly 35 years. Met my wife along the way, who was from Ecuador, brought me south. But to make a long story short, she's part Indigenous from the Andes, medium Paredes, and we just got excited about agriculture and food as a space for making things happen. And of course, in the beginning, it's all about human health and organic farming and not using pesticides. But over time, we started learning about the power of agriculture for ecosystem restoration. And our big project right now is helping farms go from, let's say, net carbon sources to net carbon sinks. And how do we do that? And changing some fundamental errors in how we think about agriculture. For example, a lot of people think about it, it's really the food, or I'm sorry, it's the soil that feeds the plants. But of course, from a perspective of pedogenesis, it's actually the plants that feed the soil, right? And that's how we created the soil sponge. and how does that occur? And so it's really putting the force, putting the cheap labor force that we have available to us as farmers, which are microbes, to work for rather than against us. And how do you put the brakes on oxidation, right, of the biosphere to the opposite, sort of the reduction biochemically in farms? And our farm, I'm kind of floating above it right now. We have about 5 hectares, very intensive, organic CSA, community supported agriculture farm. We supply to just over 300 families. We've delivered over 20,000 food baskets. But this was a desert. I need to show an earlier photo. I think Paul's probably seen them. We started with water harvesting and then, isolating and inoculating microbes into the subsoil, what's called Concagua in Quechua, the cemented ash rock, and then getting live roots in there and photosynthesis, putting photosynthesis to work and feeding microbes so that microbes could begin to build the soil. And so, it's been a process for us of going from a rock to an oasis, at 2,700 meters in the highland Andes of Ecuador. And we're part of a big network of farmers, immediately about 150 that are dedicated to this experimenting and helping to push the envelope of what's possible in this approach to regenerative farming, going from degenerative to regenerative farming. But we're plugged into much broader networks of actually tens of thousands of farmers and eaters, because harder than the agronomics is actually working with the people who eat. We work in a market oriented society. We can't farm in isolation. We need people to help finance it. So, in our case, the 300 and now 50 families that support our farm need to become enamored, right, with this perspective, need to become eaters, not for degeneration, but regeneration. And so the process of how do we get them involved in this so they start to create demands on us and they begin to actually eat the sort of crops that allow me to feed the microbes and to maximize photosynthesis on my farm and to actually build, let's say, terrestrial carbon. So I'll stop there, but I just wanted to kind of give a quick summary about what we're up to.
Well, thanks, Stephen. And my mouth is beginning to water just imagining how fresh and tasty the products of your microbial soil are, and how lucky the 350 shareholders, if you will, in your farm are to receive your bounty. And as you may or may not know, this conversation follows a very interesting conversation that we had last week, which was on microbes. And in fact, it was called, I think, Microbes, Climate's Tiny Titans. And we talked about how microbes can be, for better or worse, significantly affecting our climate in ways that we know and lots of ways that we're yet to discover. And you're on the front lines with your, what one paper called the microbial majority of living creatures on the planet. So we'll want to hear more about that. But for now, I want to turn it over to Paul Beckwith. Paul, as you know, is a climate systems scientist from Ottawa. He is a prolific YouTube video person on climate, having covered virtually every topic, and maybe I can take the word virtually out, having covered every topic on climate imaginable. And as always, we welcome you, Paul, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Herb, and thank you, Stephen. Great overview. I love how you talk about the microbes being a very good workforce, basically, for you. They don't go on strike, and they don't require a lot of pay, and they're there in copious quantities, churning away doing their work. One question I have that comes to mind first is, what sort of metrics are you using to measure things? Like, presumably over time the soil quality is getting better. Are you doing analysis of this of the nutrients and the composition of the soil over time to actually show that change? The families that you're feeding and supporting, the 350 families, has their health shown improvements over the time period that they're getting much healthier foods? Just sort of things like that. It's one thing to say that things are going much better, but often people like metrics, some sort of measurement to show that. Like, for example, water retention in the soil. Water is a huge issue for you. I think you have some holding ponds and things. So maybe a few more details about that sort of aspect would be great.
Sure, and I should mention I work with the university. I have a PhD. My background's more in plant pathology, how to kill microbes rather than how to keep them alive. And I have to say, everything I studied at Cornell University in upstate New York, but I work with a university in the Netherlands called Wageningen University, just part-time. But I have to say, everything I learned in plant pathology, I've been spending my whole adult life trying to unlearn because the attitude you need, right, to work with microbes is very different than work against microbes. And so and thinking of plant disease as an inspiration rather than plant health because often the pathway to disease is very different than the pathway to health. And studying disease, sometimes you actually don't find a way out. And so that took me a while, to be honest with you. So yes, I'm very much into testing. And I always tell farmers, don't accept anything I say, experiment, test. And so we work with farmer experimenters. We have these big networks. We promote what we call ecological literacy. So we help farmers understand how ecosystems work, things like photosynthesis in the beginning, but also microbial groups. We do a lot of work with microscopes to help farmers understand through a drop of water that represents a hectare what's going on. And so there's a lot of work with that. We do a lot of experimentation. But your question is, what are we measuring? So we have about 10 indicators we look at varying levels of complexity, and we're always playing with those. We have a series of protocols. Some of them are I would call scientific, others I might call pseudoscientific, but they work. Yeah, they give you a feeling for what's happening without having to do some sort of a complicated DNA analysis, et cetera, and things that are very expensive and often are not even available in Ecuador. So we look always at aggregation. For me, I can't aggregate a soil. Only fungi and bacteria can do this. So there's no way for me to build soils and help them go from an anaerobic state, which is what we have with the cemented ash, to an aerobic state that begins to help things begin to diversify and structure. Once you get oxygen in the soils, it becomes a suitable environment for roots. And the single best way to improve a soil are live roots pumping in photosynthase. So we always look at aggregation. We do look at fungal bacteria biomass. Okay, we understand this as sort of ecologically as successions, going from a desert to a climax forest and the successional stages in between. And farming is someplace in between there. But there's ways that you can manage soil so that it continues to accumulate carbon. And we do look at different fractions of carbon. Now, more stable fractions, the best is what we call microbial necromass, dead microbes. They are the more stable forms of carbon that might last 45 to 300 years, where a lot of the other kind of organic forms of carbon are more labile. They might last 3 months or 6 months. And if you're interested in accumulating carbon in soil, you're interested in the sort of exodus also of the microbes themselves and how they take the sugars from photosynthase and they create these aggregates and all the structures that you get in there and the dead microbes and the glues, the glomulins that are there is really the stable carbon. So we look at carbon fractions, we look at this aggregation, we can measure that in complicated ways, but we also have applications like slakes. Slakes is something quite nice by, I think it's called the International Soil Management Institute, the Soil Health Institute out of the US. It's a free application that you can put in your telephone. And it takes sort of a visual image and it'll digitalize that image and give you a score of levels of aggregation. So those are some, but we also look at life. So we look at worms, macro and micro arthropods. We teach farmers how to look at these, isolate these things and look at abundance and diversity. And these sorts of indicators give you a feeling for whether your soil is increasingly healthy in terms of oxygen, in terms of structure, because all the important things in a soil happen in the spaces, right? The growth of roots the movement of water, the movement of gases, the movement of animals. And so a healthy soil is a structured soil. And so for me, that's the single best way to do that. And we can get, and I do have students that do better measurement. We've measured in this farm behind me that we're harvesting about 10 to 15 metric tons of carbon per hectare per year. And that's a large amount, by the way. And we can continue to do that. We go from about 1% organic matter carbon in our soil to about the natural holding capacity of our ecosystem, which is about 9 to 12%. And then it'll start to level off. And many of my soils are now 7, 8% organic matter carbon. And the majority of that, the stable stuff, is coming from photosynthesis, maximizing photosynthesis, not from the organic inputs that I bring into the farm. We try to mobilize the cycles, right?
Quick question, two quick questions, and I'll let Herb take over with some questions. The first is maybe give us an idea of some of the major crops that you're actually growing. I think coffee is one of them. And the second thing is, a big difference. You're right at the equator, right? So your soils are being used year round versus, say, soils in Ottawa, where I am. Half the year the ground's frozen, right? The soil is just lying dormant. So there's a big difference between equatorial farming that you're doing and, say, farming for somebody at higher latitude. So maybe you can just say some of the, I mean, you're the expert. Maybe just so we can understand some of these differences would be helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you. And you're asking great questions. I'm at high altitude. I'm actually in the valley, but I'm at 2,700 meters. And the mountains around me go up to 6,000 meters. So I'm in the lowlands, right? In the Andes. I'm less than a minute from the equator. So yes, we're right at the equator. I have 12 hours of light, 365 days. I use greenhouses. I have 5 greenhouses that we use for tomatoes. They need more than 12 hours of light to mature. So we do play with greenhouses to do certain European crops, although tomatoes are American, but we grow European varieties. It needs 15, 17 hours of calorie equivalent to mature, on and on. But so yes, we have 12 hours of light every day. And to be honest with you, many of the, so there's 550 million smallholder farmers like me that have about 2 to 3 hectares. Most of us are living on the worst soils. And for me, the worst soils are strategic for two reasons. Where the poor live. And secondly, if you want to increase terrestrial carbon, don't go to the forest. We need to protect the forest, but go to where it's been degraded, where we've already burned off the biosphere. So we can go from 1 degree to 7 degree instead of harvesting 10, 15 metric tons per hectare per year. And that's where we get drawdown. To date, agriculture, smallholder farmers are not on the radar screen of climate change mitigation funding. For me, it's criminal. And they need to be. So 550 million farmers, we manage over 3 billion hectares. 3 billion of the 14 million, this group of 14 billion hectares is managed by smallholder farmers like me and on these smallholder farms across the planet, living on the equator. And for me, if we want to, you don't have to pay us, right? I have a vested interest in doing this to improve my productivity. Okay. I need knowledge. I need scientific backstopping to make sure this is working, that I'm increasing carbon and not oxidizing my soils. We need some support, but we don't need financing. We need investment, from my perspective, of putting to work these 550 million farmers across the planet to actually start to shift our farms from sources to sinks of carbon. And for me, we could deliver. And today, the vast majority, they see us as like beneficiaries of climate change adaptation policies, but not of climate change mitigation. Farmers as actors of helping us solve one of the most existential threats we have on this planet. And this is really, at the end of the day, where I see we need to make public investments. Yeah, and that's our agenda as smallholder farmers. And we're receiving zero support in Ecuador and in most countries across the planet.
Wow. You answered the question I was just about to ask better than I could even imagine you would. And that was basically people watching this would say, "Oh, it's very nice to hear about a small farmer. What does this have to do with the climate emergency?" Well, you just answered that question, and or certainly began to answer that question in a very compelling way. Are you familiar, Stephen, with the ecosystem or the Eco Restoration Alliance? They're a group I'm involved with, of people like yourself from all over the world that are coming together, and we'll put a link to that group. And I would like to invite you and anyone else listening to come to one of their meetings because I think you'll find that you have a lot to offer them, and they have a lot to offer all sorts of folks. If I had to ask you then, given the fact that you've articulated the enormous potential for smallholder farming to, in addition to all the other benefits, to draw down massive amounts of carbon and presumably also directly cool the climate, because generally barren land, basically is much hotter than rich, fertile soils with trees and plants and crops and so forth. So, what would you say? And you're saying what I believe I heard you say is that financing, which surprised me a little bit, isn't necessarily a big obstacle. So, what would you say if you had to pick one or two key obstacles, either in your community and country or more broadly, that we should all try to focus on overcoming so that the kind of statistics and vision that you're presenting to us can be fulfilled? And the last thing I'll say is we all know, and I'm sure those listening know it, that we don't have much time. This is not one of those things that can slowly evolve over 100 or 200 years or so in an organic way, no pun intended. If we're going to be able to tackle the crisis, we need to make these changes rapidly. So, turning it back over to you, Stephen.
So for me, I'm not necessarily against the whole payment for carbon kind of credits system, and that can work for certain types of farmers, but it doesn't work on 2 hectares. Where people are making $40 per hectare per year because of whatever, it just would not make sense. But where it can work with different agencies that are working with 1,000 farmers, right? That in our case, we're working with an area of about 200,000 hectares of farmers, the poor Andean farmers in Ecuador who live on this cemented ash, Concagua, in Quichua soil, who are indigenous primarily, who have with a vested interest in questions of food security and survival, but also we view them as potential actors in climate change mitigation. Our goal is the support services, the training, right? The sort of supporting the farmer-led extension. Most of the work we want to do is farmer to farmer, and then the scientific backstopping. Having students and a couple of good universities who are focused on this who can help us challenge the productivity and the performance of our technologies, right? Our changes to maximize photosynthesis, to maximize carbon drawdown. Of course, carbon, as you all know, is oversimplification. We can look at methane and we can look at other gases. And that's part of the challenge is coming up with the indicators, the protocols, and the teams of people who can backstop and challenge the farmer-led research. But we all know, regenerative agriculture means stop tilling the ground. We have to stop moving the soil and we destroy these communities. It's like a rampage fire that goes through a community like Ottawa. You destroyed a community, it takes a lot of energy to build that community back up. Well, that's exactly what we do every time we till soil. These animals, these microbes, have constructed a system that's very sophisticated, and every time we rip it up, they have to invest energy in rebuilding it. So anyhow, we have to limit tillage. We have to stop using biocides. I often argue what's worse than insecticides and other biocides are fertilization. We have to stop over fertilizing. I don't fertilize. I stopped fertilizing on my ground. You'll see it's green. It's very productive. I stopped fertilizing eight years ago. I argue you don't need to fertilize in good agriculture because over fertilization will feed over too much nitrogen will feed the bacteria that will oxidize, the soil, which will collapse the aggregates, and you go backwards. So we need, and the other one is diverse live roots pumping in photosynthase. It's not just, because every plant has co-evolved with communities of microbes, and we need a certain structure of plants depending on where you're from in your ecosystem. But it's usually, 4 to 8 kind of groups of plants that will keep the microbial competition going so that they can continue to develop the soil. Well, what is that? Well, that's a scientific question. We need some good scientists to help us work that out in every locality. And then we need eaters who will eat those plants, right? We can bring them in and get plants that need to be marketable. And so for our big challenge is what are the edible plants and the perennials, ideally, permanent plants that I can grow on my farm, that I can connect to a market, and we can work on the diet and the consumption side simultaneously so that we can build that into our system so we can finance this through local markets. So anyhow, my argument at the end of the day is don't pay us for carbon credits, put us to work through knowledge, scientific innovation, and market development, where we can kind of co-evolve a way into regenerative agriculture. And it's not only possible, it already exists, right? I can name probably 1,000 farms here in Ecuador that are accumulating carbon. But they're on the margins of the dominating patterns of farming in a place like Ecuador. So for me is how do we take these positive deviants out there and start to normalize this process? Well, we'll only do it if eaters become part of this dynamic. I can bore you with some of these details, but anyhow, I think it's a hopeful message, but it has to happen quick. Like you said, we might have 50 or 100 years. We probably don't have more than that to get this right.
Do you see any signs where you are, or I assume you're scanning what's happening in North America and elsewhere of, quote unquote, big ag, the land grant universities and the chemical companies and the Cargills and so forth becoming more open to this model of growth, or do they see that as something they have to stomp on, not unlike the pharmaceutical companies that try to eliminate the supplements and all the rest of that to keep their markets?
So 25 years ago, I was really focused on eliminating highly toxic pesticides. One of the things we achieved in Ecuador, we did the studies, we had thousands of farmers demonstrating you can produce in the Andes without highly toxic pesticides. We did this in 1999, 2000, 2010. Ecuador eliminated highly toxic pesticides from the market. Where I'm going is it was one of the first countries on the planet to do it. But we had already a decade before, demonstrated this possible. Innovation, the government tends to come well behind innovation at the farming level. And even university thinking comes behind. And so for me, the site of this needs to be practice. Practice not as a noun, but as a verb, right? Where people are somehow making things, where the rubber hits the road and you and I are getting things done and dealing with this tension between what I want and what's possible. And resolving that every day and moving in a certain direction. Of course, the science will backstop us eventually. But the problem is right now we're investing in state-led solutions and scientifically led solutions. My argument is science should not be looking for a solution. It needs to be asking tough questions. We need to study heterogeneity of practice and focus on these sort of outlying, what we call counter movements or positive deviants that already demonstrate these possibilities, that are already accumulating carbon, that are somehow generating health or high productivity with low fertilization, and then give them oxygen, right? And put them to work. And that's part of the big problem we have with modernization in agriculture is it's really about homogenizing farming practice rather than diversifying practice. We live in a dynamic world where farming has to constantly diversify. There's never a solution. But we build these business models around patenting technology, scaling up in an instrumental way. For me, and the reason why I don't focus on large farmers, because small farmers are much more dynamic. I can change 5 hectares faster than I can change 5,000 hectares. And then what I do is I multiply it across farms. But yes, to get back to your question, there's some big farmers, farmers that I have interacted with in Canada and US, they're usually, above 1,000 hectares that are on this sort of pathway. There's some very exciting movements in regenerative agriculture. They don't get the numbers we get in terms of carbon drawdown, but of course, they do so slowly and they can do so in an evolutionary way. But they're much more integrated in markets and they have much less margins of maneuverability than I would have. And that's why I think smallholder farmers are so strategic, because we can demonstrate the future very quickly. And then it's well, how do you scale that up? That's a question for larger farmers. Unfortunately, politically, this larger farmers tend to have more influence than these small farmers. And so there's some structural problems there. And a lot of this problem with biological farming is by nature, we're working with things that can't be patented. These things can be reproduced on my farm. All the biological products I use in my farm, I can teach you how to do on your farm. It's through knowledge, right? It's knowledge intensive. So it doesn't really mesh well with classic ways of thinking about capitalism. I'm not necessarily against capitalism, but this sort of industry driven food is a big mistake. It doesn't work well. That's what we've learned over the last 75 years. The food generates probably 35% of the gases that are behind greenhouse. If you think of food broadly, meaning production,
Yeah.
transport, circulation, and consumption, and the garbage we generate with food, I would say about a third of all greenhouse gases are driven through the food system.
Hmm.
And what's interesting is all of us have to eat, right? So we're already complicit. And being complicit means that you and I have access to food. And we can utilize our food space to transform these relationships. And there's enough money there. Ecuador spends about $25 billion a year on food and drink, non-alcoholic drink. The US is about 4 trillion. We don't need more than 4 trillion, well, $20 billion in Ecuador to transform our agriculture across 250,000 smallholder families. So for me, it's not an issue of more money, it's redirecting the money we are already investing in destroying this planet. Well, how can we redirect that into regenerating the planet? Yes.
That's the big question. I'm looking at Paul, and I know you've got about a half a dozen questions and
Well,
comments you're so eager to make, and the floor is yours. Go for it.
Just a couple more points that maybe that I'm not would like to know more about is for us high latitudiners, we're seeing more and more extreme weather events from mangled jet streams, etc. As an equatorial person, right, you're seeing changes in climate and weather patterns. I understand you've had a lot of storms recently, for example, a lot of time required to clear fields and stuff. How are weather patterns changing at the equator? Can you tell us a bit more about that and how it's affecting your farming?
yeah. So if you know much about Ecuador, we're on the Pacific coast. I'm 7 hour drive, let's say downhill to the coast. But we have this Humboldt current that comes up from Antarctica. And I understand you would understand this much better than me. And I'd love to know your insights on this. But apparently, the movement of the Humboldt current, and as it comes closer or farther away from the coast, shifts the weather patterns in the lowlands and in the highlands. It tends to involve heavier rainfalls on the coast and drier periods in the lowlands. I've been here 25, farming 25 years at this spot. And the sort of thing I was told by climate scientists is that we should receive about the same quantity of rainfall per year. In our case, that was about 600 millimeters per year. Well, this year we've already received over 1,000. And the idea, their argument was we're going to receive about the same rainfall, but it's going to be fewer, more severe events. And of course, with steep slopes in the Andes, that's a big problem. And you have to make infrastructure investments to harvest that water and store it. And so we've been gearing up on my farm. We harvest about 1 million liters in these sort of geomembrane tanks. You can see one on my behind me. And we have a chain of these that we harvest rainfall, we store it, and then we micro irrigate through drip irrigation. And that was our first big investment. As we say, con agua mierda no hay cultivo que se pierda. With water and shit, you'll never lose a crop. And so it's very key to get that water guaranteed. And my father always said, don't buy land, buy water, right? So yes, water is a critical tool, and then it's sunlight harvesting, but through plants. Okay, so we're getting fewer, but we're supposed to get the same amount of rainfall in fewer events, fewer stronger events. Last couple of years are a bit off. But what's very key for us is you need to guarantee your water across the year. We used to have a 5 month dry period from June until October, and it would get zero rainfall. But now the rain is invading that area. So it's very key to capture water and be able to distribute it across the year because we get wet periods in the middle of the dry season, and we get dry periods in the middle of the wet season. So water is a great tool, and all the research we need to do as farmers and scientists to do that well and efficiently is a critical piece. But I will say that for some reason, Paul, we're getting about twice as much rainfall now in the highlands. And I don't quite know why. I don't know if that's temporary
Okay, well,
or
that's my
not.
job to try to. I'll have to research this and do a video on climate change in the equatorial regions. That's on my. I just wrote that down. It's on my to-do list for understanding that because, yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, the ocean currents are key to the weather patterns that we're seeing. I mean, most people are concerned about the North Atlantic, the AMOC, Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation slowing down. I did a video just on Antarctica, and what we're seeing is theoretically, with global warming, water is lighter, so the Antarctic circumpolar current should actually be slowing down over time, but we're actually seeing them doing some very strange things and bringing water a lot closer to Antarctica underneath the ice shelves, for example, which of course, has huge implications. I must admit that the ocean current that I know least about is your ocean current that you were just describing, right? I know it comes up from Antarctica and it can have a huge influence because if it's very cold current coming from Antarctica, the Agulas. And depending on how close it comes to the coast and how wide it is and how deep it goes, it has a huge impact on weather, obviously, changes in South America. So anyway, it's on my homework list, to-do list. So it's sort of key to some of the patterns that you're seeing with weather and I mean, these storms that you got recently in the last few months, were they high wind storms? Were they torrential rainstorms? Because, of course, being on a slope, right? I mean, you have to be very worried about landslides and things like that if the rain is too excessive.
You know what they've been? They've been strong storms, but they've been more electrical than anything I've ever experienced in my life. And that's another question. Huge and violent thunder and lightning.
Right.
Um, and, we've always had that in the highland Andes, but it's even been greater. But yes, as well. And so there's a lot of electrical activity going on and huge effects on the infrastructure in Ecuador, destroying.
I mean, that's a whole new different topic. That's a great topic, the electrical, like lightning storms, electrical activity, because you get charge separation between the ground and the clouds, and it builds up a high voltage potential. You get the lightning strikes. Generally, with climate change and warming, we can expect more intense storms and more electrical activity. But interestingly enough, there's parts of the world where lightning has reduced by over 50%. And I'm talking about major shipping lanes because in 2020 they restricted sulfur in shipping fuels. Therefore, there's less aerosols in the air, and the regions right over the major shipping routes into, say, Singapore and places are seeing much, much less lightning, 50% lower in those shipping lanes, but then there's more lightning everywhere else. So there's a lot of factors that are at play here, which are just fascinating. So I'll put it back to Herb to bring it back to ground us a bit more on farming because I kind of carried us off in a different space here.
Well, that we count on you, Paul, to do that. And that's actually, as we've been saying, one of the strengths of the Climate Emergency Forum, that we don't ignore the fact that everything is connected, and that the best and richest conversations are ones that veer off into other directions, because it's often those other directions that will come back to make a difference in what the main thing we're talking about. So whether it's ocean currents or lightning, or the influence of land grant universities, or carbon credits. It's all connected. And Stephen, all those forces, sort of connect to what you're doing literally on the ground in terms of enriching your soil, as you've been eloquently talking about, and not just enriching your own soil, but enriching the ecosystem of the farming communities nearby, or maybe even at some distance from you. And so I guess my sort of semi kind of fantasy question would be, what would the world look like if we had 10,000 Stevens? And maybe we do, and we just have to go find them. And you probably know many folks like yourself doing this elsewhere.
There are, and most of what I do, I feel like I copy. I've become inspired by others, and there's great interaction on this, excuse me. And so, yes, it is an issue of finding these and giving them oxygen and connecting. But yeah, one thing I wanted to talk, I live in a Quichua community. Quichua is the sort of, old Andean tongue around the Incas, etc. They have some traditions. And I know in Canada, for example, the First Nations and Indigenous people are very strong communities as well. Often we romanticize, right, indigeneity in places like Ecuador, and sometimes we neglect it. But the notion of Pachamama, the Mother Earth, is strong in Andean culture, but it's become like a touristy symbol. And there's this other notion called Sumak Kalsai, Quechua. Sumak Kalsai, they translated in Spanish to mean like the good life, living crazy, having fun. Well, that's not what Sumak Kalsai means. Sumak Kalsai is this deep Andean concept. My mother-in-law has been teaching me this for the last 20 years about it's really this instinct of feeling about how to take care of the central life force being, right? And the Pachamama, it's interesting to listen to these people, but instead of being romantic, we need to take a lot of this age old farming tradition and make it functional. And that's what we've lost as we've shifted too radically towards commercial markets as a way of being. And where this comes interesting is when we bring science to bear. So I had a bunch of indigenous women at our farm this week, Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, Andean people who talk about the Pachamama, the Earth Mother, and they live this. And they say, we've always felt it, but until we put microbes under a microscope, right? Because you take a drop of soil with them, you put it under a microscope, and they see billions of individuals in a little drop. And they see them competing, protozoas and bacteria and fungi. They said, we always felt the Pachamama, but we actually had never seen it. And they didn't understand when they till the soil how much damage they do. And this whole notion about they speak about the sun, the Inti in Quechua culture, but they never understood the centrality of the sun and photosynthesis and the role that gave to converting the rock into a soil sponge. But so part of this issue about ecological literacy is putting to bear the power of science in an explicit way that help people strengthen their culture and put that and make it functional so they can solve practical problems, not just for productivity, but when they learn about climate change and this whole carbon cycle thing, they get it. And they feel like they're on this mission, right? And they say, many of these people say, well, my whole goal in life now is to return my body into the soil so I can return the carbon cycle and keep it going. And this sort of passion, and we need to do this across our families and communities, but I think indigenous people are closer to this than the average urban. And putting resources and knowledge in the hands of these people, not in a romantic way, in a practical way. So they become central actors and not just beneficiaries of like solidarity or of charity, but actually people we see to help us get out of this existential threat, I think is a good investment. And that's where I'm putting my money and my time and my energy. Not because I feel as I'm not driven by charity. It's more because it's fun. It's exciting to watch what these people do and they become inspired. And then it inspires me. So get back to your question about where are these thieves out there? Well, actually, I'm drawing off of people like my mother-in-law and these other Quechua indigenous people around me. For me, the hard part is working with urban people. And that's where I wanted to ask you because I know we're connected through markets. I know I can't do anything on my farm without getting urban people excited about this and become part of this movement. But I think that's the big challenge is getting humans reconnected to the planet and this sense of humility that I can't control the planet. The best we can do is learn how to live in and with the planet. We're not part of ecosystems. We are ecosystems, right? These things flow through us. And that sort of sense of humility is very hard to teach my daughter, right? Who wants to spend most of her life connected to the internet and hanging out with influencers, people like Paul, influencers like Paul on the internet. So I think there is something to learn about indigenous people as a resource to address these problems. But how to work with urban people, that's my biggest challenge. and get
Now
them involved.
that sounds like the subject for the next time you come. We'll focus on that because we're sort of running out of time today. Though it just struck me, probably a ridiculous idea, but I'll say it anyway, that let's say every time you walked into a store and you picked up, as I did this morning at the local Whole Foods where I'm staying in Phoenix here, and you picked up a fresh red pepper or grapefruit, it had a little sticker on it with a QR code, and you could scan the QR code, and your mother-in-law would appear in a 30-second video explaining the history of that grapefruit and all the benefits, et cetera, as opposed to somebody picking up a grapefruit in the Safeway. With all, my apologies to Safeway or whatever your standard grocery store is, and the QR code there shows a farmer, on a tractor with 20,000 acres, and he can't see straight because there's so much chemical fumes enveloping him. So anyway, that's my thought today. What do you think, Stephen?
I'm
Yeah,
all for it. It could even be live with the technology we have
you're
Well,
right.
yeah,
It could
exactly.
be. Yeah.
Well, it depends on how much time your mother-in-law wants to devote to this.
now.
Well, I want to thank you so much. It's been a delight. Charles and Heidi and Paul were so excited when they told me that you'd be coming, and I thought, what's the big deal? Now I know what the big deal is. You're really a remarkable guy. You're doing wonderful things, and you're able to convey that wonder and passion in a very down-to-earth, accessible way. Well, I was going to ask you one more question, but I'm going to stop there. Thank Paul as always. We're sorry that Peter Carter couldn't make it today. Thanks so much, Stephen. Will you come back again soon and we'll continue this conversation?
No, definitely. And I'm hoping maybe we could team up from Brazil.
Thank you
But
so much,
yeah,
Stephen. And
Thanks. And let me just say
thank you.
that
Yeah.
if you like this video, and I can't imagine you wouldn't, please like this on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, take a look at our website, theclimateemergencyforum.org. Find your way to our donate button, which allows us to continue doing what is now over 200 videos in the past few
Well,
years or so. Leave us your comments, your suggestions for future programs. Share this conversation with your friends and your family, and be conscious as you grow, preferably, or purchase the food you eat, and keep in mind the kinds of lessons and examples that Stephen gave us today. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you next week.